My name is Dan Finucane, and I'm currently a regent. I love folk music, blues music, and I love singing and playing with other people.
My name is Ian Peoples. I'm a Jesuit regent. I'm kind of a football fanatic. Most of my weekends are spent watching at least a few games. I'm probably one of the biggest Lionel Messi fans.
Hi, and welcome back to MagisTalk. My name is Dan Finucane. I'm joined by my co-host and Jesuit brother, Ian Peoples. And we have a very special guest with us today, Father Doug Marcouiller, who came here all the way from Rome, Italy. Yes, you heard that right. Where he is a general counselor to the Superior General, the boss of the Jesuits, as well as the regional assistant for the Canada and USA Assistancy at the Jesuit Curia in Rome.
So it really is wonderful that you came all the way from Rome just to be on MagisTalk. It's wonderful to have you.
Anytime.
No, of course you didn't come all the way just for MagisTalk, but we are very happy to have you on the show. What did bring you to Belize, Father Doug?
Well, I've been to Belize before, and I'm delighted to be back. But there's a meeting coming up next week. The Jesuits of the region of North America, so actually that goes from Micronesia through Belize, Haiti, Puerto Rico, the United States and Canada, are organized in 5 provinces, and the head of each of those provinces is coming to meet here next week. So I'm here to be with the provincial superiors.
And why was Belize chosen as, it's wonderful to have all these really people doing really important work for the Society of Jesus coming to Belize. What was that discernment or decision-making? What went into that?
Well, it wasn't my decision, but I imagine it has something to do with it being February.
Very practical.
You bet.
Wonderful weather this time of year here in Belize, and
not in New York.
Exactly, not where the wind chill has been horrible in the Northeast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, one of the things we like to ask all of our guests is to get a sense of their upbringing, what role their faith played in their upbringing. And so I know that's a wide snapshot, but if you could just maybe spend a couple minutes describing what role did your faith play as you were growing up, and then we'll eventually get to the Jesuit vocation part.
Well, I'd say that I'm still growing up, right? People are still trying to bring me up, right? My friends and my family. And that's important because when you look at faith is really a relationship, right? It's a relationship with God. And over the course of a life, that relationship, any relationship changes. It has high points, and then you go through rough spots. And the quality of a parent's relationship with their children changes over the lifetime. And I think the quality of my relationship with the Lord is maturing and changing. Of course, the rough spots come from me, not from God. God is always faithful.
Well, that's helpful for me, just to know that there's that, looking to you as someone who has accomplished a lot in the Society of Jesus and is doing important work, to say, I still am growing in that faith relationship. Inspires me to have a little patience with myself, I guess. So that's great.
It is true, though, that you can trace these relationships far back, and in the scriptures, so often you use the word upbringing. So often, other people bring their friends to Jesus, right? So there's a sick person who's brought by his friends, or a mother who brings the situation of her daughter, or it's actually Andrew who calls Simon Peter to meet Jesus. And so over my life too, there have been lots of people who have brought me closer to the Lord, who've invited me into a deeper relationship with God, I would say. So going way back, I grew up outside Chicago with my parents. We're a family with 6 kids. We lived close to the Catholic Church, and I was able to take advantage of after-school catechism classes and sacramental celebrations and so on. But we were always sent to public schools, and I really value that. Many of my friends were from Protestant families or from Jewish families. And I think that really helped me. My Boy Scout troop was sponsored by the Presbyterian Church. And so I think this relationship that was given to me is very Catholic. It's very rooted in the Catholic community, but it's a kind of a Catholicism that recognizes God's grace working in everybody, everywhere. And so it's not kind of closed in. And then, you know, over and over again, the relationship has taken twists and turns when I've encountered other people. But we'll probably get to that.
Yeah. Well, and maybe, you know, to talk a little bit more about your education, you spent time for your undergrad at Princeton, and then did a master's degree at Yale. What were those degrees in?
The undergraduate degree was an interdisciplinary social science, public policy kind of degree, and the master's was in international relations. Okay,
so, you know, those are degrees that you could do a whole lot with. So kind of what led you to those, to study those things? And then what got you interested in the society?
I loved my time at both Princeton and Yale. They're wonderful universities. The intellectual environment was very exciting, and the community was very welcoming and very dedicated to service, so very outward looking. But in talking about Princeton and Yale, you skip an experience in the middle that was very important. Because when I finished my undergraduate work, I went and spent a year working as a volunteer with the Jesuits in Honduras. There had been some Jesuit graduate students at Princeton while I was an undergraduate. They worked in the Catholic Student Center, and so that was how I met the Jesuits. And through them, connected with the Jesuits in Honduras. Went and had a full-time job teaching in the Jesuit school. I think I taught 5 subjects, 3 of which I had never studied before, which is very common.
Yeah.
It's kind of our way. But I also got to know the Jesuits fairly well. This was in the late 70s. There was one Jesuit in the school, but most were working with farming communities. And so under the impulse of the Catholic leadership of the time, these communities of campesinos were reading the scriptures and reflecting together on how they were called to live and what changes the world needed. Of course, there were other people who thought the world was just fine as it was. They didn't want any change. And so some pretty strong repression came against those communities, and the Jesuits were part of those communities. So they went through that with a lot of courage, and that struck me. A lot of boldness, a big dream, confidence. But what most struck me was that they laughed a lot. And so in these really difficult circumstances, they talked everything over in the evening, and they laughed about what had happened during the day. So it was that experience of knowing the Jesuits in Honduras that stayed with me at Yale in the 2 years that I was there. As I say, there were wonderful years, but I kept feeling that maybe for me there was something else, something more in a way, at least for me, is something that would be a little bit bolder, a bigger dream. Something that would call for a deeper commitment. And that's how I ended up going to the novitiate.
Wow. And what I liked about what you said there is it's something that I've heard from other Jesuits, and I think it's been true for me too, is a sense of that there's a joy, and that joy comes even in the midst of really difficult situations. And I think Ian and I experienced that. You know, our ministry here can be challenging, but there is a joy that's underneath all of that. So I think, I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's such an important piece of any vocation. Like hopefully there's joy, hopefully there's a sense of being drawn to something bold, something that is broader than maybe what we first imagined. So I just think that's the way you put that, I think is really important.
You know, Pope Francis speaks about joy all the time, to be ministers of the joy of the gospel. And so if there isn't any joy, you kind of wonder what's going on, what spirits are weighing us down, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely.
And a few moments ago, before we were on camera, you were telling us about your experience, not only in Honduras, but also in El Salvador. And you have this really, I think what happened in Honduras, it seems like, is that this lifelong love for Central America in general, and for maybe Honduras and El Salvador and Belize in particular, maybe as well as Guatemala, but it really, lifelong love was born out of that experience because you've come back pretty much every year since then, correct?
More or less.
More or less. And you teach at the Universidad Central America in El Salvador. Is that every year?
Well, not during COVID, but almost every year. During the process of Jesuit formation, after I was ordained a priest, my first year as a priest I spent in El Salvador, not in Honduras. And it was a very challenging experience, but also incredibly rich and confirming. While I was there, Ignacio Ellacuría, who was the famous president of the university, started an MBA program. And because of my studies at Yale, he asked if I could teach a course. A couple of years later, he and 5 other Jesuits and Alba and Selena Ramos were murdered by the Salvadoran army. And that just kind of made me dig in my heels a little bit, and I never gave up the course that Ellacu asked me to teach. So I've gone back most years since. Many of my longstanding friendships are in Salvador.
And we have done an episode on the Uka martyrs here on MagisTalk. So if you're interested in learning more about the Uka martyrs and the individuals that Father Doug is referring to, look up that episode online. It'll be on YouTube and Facebook. But because it's such a powerful story and one that's personally inspired me as a Jesuit, just to really to stand for justice and love in the face of death, right? And to not back down is such an inspiration. And to my first visit to the Uka was last year in March, and just to be in the site of their martyrdom, and they have a museum there. It's just it makes the faith tangible and real in a way that it's just much more stark than we're used to, right? But it is the story. I understood why the seeds of the church is in the blood of the martyrs. That there's such a powerful witness to that faith that they express. So it's wonderful that you are a part of that, and it's obviously inspired you in your work.
I think that word stark is helpful, not to undercut the joy, but I'm kind of a slow learner, I would say. And so going back to my first days in Honduras, the stories of the gospel seemed like daily life there in a way that they hadn't so much in Chicago, because the way people were living wasn't that far away from some of the stories that I was reading. And so sometimes it's a privilege to be in a place where the gospel is proclaimed with such clarity,
I want to move forward a little bit, because you were the provincial of the Missouri province, which has since joined with the New Orleans province to become the U.S. Central and Southern province, which we are a part of. And that Missouri province included Belize. And so, like you said before, you've been to Belize. What gifts do you think Belize gives the church, and maybe in particular the Society of Jesus?
Oh, there's so many, really. There's so many gifts that Belize brings to the table, so to speak. At a personal level, when the Superior General first asked me about moving to Rome, I said, like any Jesuit would, well, whatever you ask. But I'd really rather go to Belize. But he smiled and said, I don't think that's going to happen. But maybe someday.
Not yet.
Not yet. If I were to focus on gifts, I think I'd underscore just 2 out of many. The first is care for creation, and the second is care for cultures. So care for creation, Belize is famous for having been blessed with this remarkably rich environmental diversity that's under threat all over the world. But there are people here who are thinking about, well, how can we work together to care for our common home, which of course is one of the perspectives that Pope Francis calls the whole church to, and that he's called Jesuits to in particular, to have that perspective of caring for our common home. I'm not close enough to Belize to know all the ins and outs of environmental policy, but my sense is that people here see the blessing that is still here and feel the need to protect it and to develop it in a responsible way. But the other thing has to do with cultures. Over my years of formation as a Jesuit, I was blessed by friendships with many Belizean Jesuits. And if you look at their last names, they all came from different communities, right? Mm-hmm. So they could be Creole, or they could be Garifuna, they might be Spanish-speaking, they might be Laculiancho from the south, they might be Mayan. This is a remarkably intercultural community. And this is something that's always been close to the hearts of Jesuits since the very beginning. From early days, the Jesuits were an intercultural group composed of people from all over Europe. But right at the beginning, they put themselves at the disposal of the Holy Father, of the Pope, to go anywhere in the world he wanted to send them. And that first generation ended up in Africa, and in India, and in Asia, and in America. And they brought the gospel, but they also discovered the grace of God at work already in the places that they went. This was brought home to me last summer. I accompanied our Superior General on a trip to Pine Ridge in South Dakota, which is a Lakota, a reservation of the Lakota people in the United States. And we've been accompanying the Lakota since 1887 or something like that, requested by Chief Red Cloud and Chief Spotted Tail, who went to Washington and said, if you're going to send us people, send us these black robes, because they knew the tradition of Jesuits working in Canada and in the eastern United States. And those first Jesuits really prized Lakota culture. They learned a lot about it. They accompanied Lakota healers. They wrote Lakota grammars. But then we made a mistake. The policy of the federal government of the United States was to give people opportunities in the new dominant white culture by educating children outside their own culture. So to take them from their families and to teach them in English and to teach them European ways. That was a terrible mistake that we collaborated with. The federal government subsidized the schools. Mm-hmm. There are always questions that come when governments subsidize schools. It raises questions about the independence of the mission of the schools. But on the other hand, it couldn't have happened without the funding. Anyway, we went through this. We met with people who'd been raised in that system. I do remember one man who said, well, yeah, they made us learn English, but I didn't lose Lakota, and I learned Latin too. So, when we came back to Rome, we went to see Pope Francis. So Father Sosa, our superior, and I and one other guy were sitting in a room smaller than this outside the Pope's rooms in Santa Marta, talking about this experience of the Lakota, the indigenous people. And he was at the edge of his chair, really, as we were talking about this. I bring it up because particularly the rich experience that the Jesuits have had in the Toledo district. So the experience of people who've been working in St. Peter Claver Parish for probably about the same length of time, since 1888, something like that, with Kekchi and Mopan speaking communities. So it's a great gift that Belize brings to the broader church to remind us that the Spirit's working in all of these different cultures, but we have to pay attention. We have to listen. We have to see what God is doing.
Yeah, and I think it's good too. Like, I think sometimes when you're kind of immersed in the situation yourself, as we are here in the Belizean Church, I think it's good to have somebody say all these things. To say like, hey, the beauty of creation all around you. Because I think there is a risk that we take it for granted. There is a risk that all the things that are wonderful and beautiful about cultural diversity also make it difficult. How do you negotiate? But I think to see that at the end of the day, there's a lot of richness. And as you were saying, I mean, we've had a couple of episodes where we've talked about Toledo District and the richness that's there. So yeah, I think to hold that up for us to sit with and maybe savor a bit and really take another look at I think is important.
Yeah, this last summer we had an immersion opportunity for Jesuits in Formation in Toledo District, which I took part in, as well as 2 other men in formation. But we were just accompanying Father Sam Wilson and his team of Sister Hinya Bowl, who's been on our show, who's a Mopon woman, a religious sister, and then 3 lay people who are Kekchi. And we went out to the village, 4 different villages, which acted as bases for the surrounding villages to come and do a retreat with the lay leaders. And just to see the richness of the church there, the music, the copal and incense that is so central to their sacramental life, and in the Mass, it's clouds and clouds of smoke during the Mass, and it smells wonderful. But it was a beautiful experience of being immersed. And I think in Belize, you have a few of these different, very strong cultural aspects of the faith. The Garifuna is another one, right? Sure. Where it is such a unique Mass, such a unique liturgy, and so really beautiful to be able to experience these very different ways of celebrating the same faith, right? And so we shouldn't take it for granted. And all you Belizeans out there watching, it really is a gift to the church here that it's great to be reminded of.
I was ordained a priest by Bishop Martin.
Were you really? Wow!
Bishop, so that's it. Mentioning the Garifuna community brings that to mind.
And where was that ordination at?
It was in St. Louis.
In St. Louis, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
In the United States. There's a conversation going on in Europe that might be of interest. I'm not sure, but Father Sosa picks up on this often. Some people prize multiculturality, but that's understood as different cultures living side by side. So each one preserves its own culture in its own neighborhood, and we can get along without getting at each other's throats. But that's a very impoverished notion of what we're called to. What Father Sosa talks about is growing in interculturality, which means going deep into your own culture and appropriating it in a way that you can encounter a different culture and be changed. So it's a little like the gospel that we read at Mass this morning of the Syrophoenician woman and Jesus' encounter with her. It's not just enough to live in a country with many cultures. Belize, I think, has gone beyond that into creating a Belizean identity in which different cultures participate, and that's really an extraordinary gift.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point, and I think it's helpful to see that this is an ongoing project here in Belize. This question of Belizean identity, and maybe going back to Rome for a minute. We introduced you and gave your current roles for the society, being a general counselor and a regional assistant. Maybe you could tell us a little bit what that means and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. I mentioned that if the early Jesuits went all over the world. That was part of the charism, to be at the disposal of the church to serve wherever. So then the question came up, what's going to hold us together? What makes us Jesuits? Because it's not that all Jesuits do the same thing. It's not that all Jesuits live in the same conditions. It's not that all Jesuits wear the same habit like other religious communities. So for 400 years, almost 500, they said, our unity comes from something else. We're a worldwide apostolic body, but every part of the body is linked to the head. And so connection to the person we call the superior general is key to who we are as a single, united body, working in all kinds of different places in very different circumstances. Well, a lot of work goes along with his being the head of that body. And so communication has been an important part of our life since the beginning. In fact, historians of Europe always talk about the letters that Jesuits wrote back to Rome, talking about the people they were meeting and how the people lived and what their language was like and what was nature like and what kind of medicine did they have. One historian of science says that the Society of Jesus is the first international scientific organization because of the exchange of material that all came to Rome. Mm-hmm. Well, that still happens. And so an enormous amount of information about our life and our mission in different parts of the world comes to the general. And there are a dozen of us who accompany him in listening to all of that and in helping him to respond. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation, mostly including provincials and mostly focused on the dialogue between provincials and the general. But the regional assistants help in keeping track of the information that's coming, identifying the issues that are being faced, sketching out possible ways forward, and then communicating to the provincials whatever the general might want to suggest. So that's a part of it. But then we also work as a group. And so we're a council, we're not just individuals. And we meet to talk about important things worldwide with the general a couple times a week. And so we're like consultors, a group of consultors to the general. And then there are a couple jobs that weren't in the list. The last big meeting of Jesuits, the last big international meeting, they call it a general congregation. The one that elected Father Sosa, our superior general, also elected 4 people to give him feedback on his own governance style. And in the name of everybody, to say, we're really happy that you're doing these things, and here's something that seems to be falling through the cracks. And so I'm one of those people, and we meet on a regular basis to kind of review the governance of the society worldwide.
Which is a super interesting role that I think, like, how many leaders of an organization have a group that is actually there to give, positive critical feedback, but also like, no, here's some things you need to, like, to me, that just seems like a governance structure that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. And allows for, it calls the person in charge to humility. Mm-hmm. But it's also a huge responsibility, I would imagine, for you and the others that have that role.
Yeah, we certainly take it very seriously. Yeah. We usually, we meet every few months and work at it for a couple hours and then go out for a pizza afterwards.
Smooth things over.
Yeah, exactly,
Pizza does that.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's not a board of trustees or anything like that. We're under the authority of the general, right? So we give him feedback. It's an unusual setup for sure. Mm-hmm.
And I would say just with the counselors who are there giving feedback to Father General, each of them are from the different parts of the world that they're sort of representing and the assistant of, correct?
Yes,
more or less,
pretty much.
Pretty much. And so, I mean, and I know Father General has friendships and relationships probably all over the world, but it helps to have these individuals who were maybe born and raised in these various areas to bring that knowledge and that experience to the conversation as well.
No, that certainly is true, because most of us have some deep roots in particular cultures that he may or may not be familiar with. Mm-hmm. The largest group of Jesuits, the nation with the largest number of Jesuits in the world now is India. Yeah. And of course, India is hugely diverse. It's really a continent of its own. But to understand the dynamics really requires a lot of help from people who are familiar with it.
And maybe getting to that question a little bit, given that in Rome, people are ministering and are coming from across the world, what is a story or an aspect or movement in the church that should get more attention? Because we know in India there are 1 billion people, over 1 million Catholics.
Oh, many more.
Many more, 100 million Catholics maybe.
That I don't know, but lots.
lots. So what is a movement in the church that maybe you think, from your perspective, might deserve more attention than it gets from the rest of the world?
Well, I think what's going on in the church in India is really very interesting. It's very diverse. There are many Catholic churches in India, for one thing. So the Syro-Malabar Roman Church uses a different liturgy. We get so excited about small things within our own Latin rite. The church celebrates the liturgy in so many different ways. Of course, they're right now in a fight about how to celebrate the Syro-Malabar liturgy, so it happens. But I would focus more on the situation of Catholics, frankly, Christians, Muslims in India today. Because, we struggle with nationalism, but there's an intense Hindu nationalist movement in power in many parts of India. And a lot of Christian communities are suffering. The case of Father Stan Swami, for example, comes to mind. He's a man, an Indian Jesuit, who was arrested and charged with subversion or terrorism when he was maybe 85 or 86 years old, suffering from Parkinson's disease. He couldn't drink because he couldn't hold a cup. But the whole thing is ridiculous. Where does it come from? It comes from his accompanying the tribal peoples who are, the indigenous people of India, but they're not the people in power. And he had devoted his entire life to working with tribal peoples and building the church, the Catholic Church, among the tribes and creating space for them to live in peace. And he died in prison last year or 2 years ago. So I think if we paid more attention to what's going on in different places interculturally, our own agenda would change a little bit. And I think paying attention to that is important. Or Congo, the Holy Father was just in Congo. We were talking about Central America. He spoke about a Jesuit bishop who was murdered in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo maybe 15 years ago and called him the Romero of Africa. Mm-hmm. So these things are not in the distant past. It's we need to kind of be aware. That said, there's so many other things you could point to. You could point to the synodal process. You could point to, in some very highly secularized countries, young people are kind of curious about the faith now because they don't have the hostility to it that their parents and grandparents may have developed. They're not reacting against any kind of power. The church doesn't have any power. So they're kind of interested and they're saying, well, what's this all about? Mm. So there are opportunities of all sorts in all kinds of different places. Mm. And one of the things I like being in Rome is, about being in Rome, is the ability to hear some of those stories. Mm.
And it gets to our next question, which is, and I'm detecting some of this already, but what's most consoling as you look at what the society is doing in the church and in the world? What gives you a sense that the Spirit's really moving right now?
I think the world is changing, and you can point to it in so many different ways. So people are moving. Viruses are moving, money is moving, the church is changing, and the Society of Jesus is ready to change. That's what gives me the greatest courage. There are people who want to go really quickly, and that's probably a temptation, because if you read about Ignatius's discernment, it's said of him by Nadal that he never went faster than the Spirit. He was attentive to the Spirit. Mm. You go back to the story of Abraham and Sarah. God said to Abram, go, leave, take to the road. And Abram said, but where am I going to go? And God said, I'll show you. So what Father Sosa is trying to do is to lead us in this process of being attentive to what the Spirit might be asking of us now, in the way we live and in what we do, both. Because life and mission aren't two separate things. To be attentive, to be discerning the spirits in order to see where we're called to go. Of course, we're also attached, right? We hold on to what we've got. It's hard to let go. But what gives me hope is that I think the society wants to go. And wants to go quickly. There aren't too many people who say, well, there are a few who say, thank you, this is a nice spot. I'll sit on the side of the road. And there are a few people who want to go back. The Pope talks about this all the time. He says those people are not traditionalists. A traditionalist is someone with deep roots who draws life from the tradition to grow higher. And these people are indietristas. These people want to go back to something that probably never existed. And we've got some of that too. But I'd say in general, people are learning to discern together, not just as individuals, to share the movements of the Spirit, to pray together, and to see what we're being invited to do.
And that really gets to our penultimate question. We do have a final question, but our penultimate question is, what role do you see Belize playing in that movement? It may get to what you were referring to earlier about one of the two great gifts of culture and of creation, care for our common home. But what role do you see Belize playing in this movement that the Spirit is doing in the church and in the world today? It's a big question.
Well, I think I'll give the answer that I think Father General might give. You have to tell us that. The Church of Belize has to tell us that, and the Jesuits who are here have to tell us that. We have a sense given to us by Pope Francis of what direction we need to go in. Because he said, for these 10 years, wherever you are, however you live, whomever you're with, you have to work at showing the pathway to God, at accompanying, walking with people who've been pushed aside, sharing with them a mission of reconciliation and justice. You have to accompany young people as they build the future, and you have to work with other people to care for our common home. But what that means in a particular place is something that has to be figured out in that place. And that's deep in our tradition. One of the most common expressions in our constitutions is according to the circumstances of persons, places, and times. And so, if I could ask a question, I'd ask you that one. What?
Classic teacher trick.
Jesuits have been teachers for a long time.
Well, wonderful. I think that's a question that we could spend a whole other episode answering. And I think it is a question that we've explored in the past on our show. And I think from Dan, from my perspective, just to maybe give a little small answer to that question. I think it has something to do with creating hope for young people. So accompanying young people to a hope-filled future is really, I think, all of our apostolic preferences are important here, but I think that one is really a big one because I'm challenged by that question or by that mission when we are at the prison every day. And what does hope look like for people in very difficult situations? So that is something that, I sit with here in Belize. Yeah.
And I think I'd add to that a word, and Pope Francis talks about it in some of his writing, and you alluded to it, talking about your first encounters with the society, about boldness, parrhesia, that holy boldness. And I think he links it with humility, a sense of being kind of grounded in who you are, having a sense of your identity before God. And it's something that I think that there's a hunger that I hear among Belizeans in the church here to more and more find their voice and find it together in order to walk with the young, in order to spend more time with those who are on the margins of society, and to bring that voice into the public conversation. I think there's still a lot of hesitancy. Like if I speak out, if I point to what's going on, I don't know what's going to happen. But I think that there's kind of a peeking around the corner of saying, no, maybe we do have a voice. Maybe the Spirit is moving in us, whoever us might be in the room. But to bring those lenses that you mentioned to bear on what's going on here. Yeah, definitely.
And now it's time for the final question. It's an easy one for us today, I think. But this is one we'll all answer. So you'll answer first, and then Dan and I will go. But it's what's your favorite book, or one of your favorite books, if you have many. But what's one of your favorite books, and why? Why is it one of your favorites?
Well, I don't know if I'll go with my favorite. I'll go with the most recent.
Okay.
So I just flew from Rome to London to Dallas to here, and I was listening to a book, which is this delightful mystery, actually set in southwestern France, that has to do with Catalan independence and with excellent food and wine. So it was an enjoyable book to listen to.
And what was the name? What was the title of that book?
Death of a Troubadour, I think, or something like that.
Okay. Dan, what about you? I think we may have discussed this before.
I think, I was thinking, I'm trying to remember what I said last time, so I don't say the same thing this time. A book that I go back to all the time is called Backpacking with the Saints. It's a book by Belden Lane, who is a retired theologian from St. Louis University. And each chapter is him going on a hike somewhere, doing some backpacking, usually in the state of Missouri, where I'm from, so I'm proud of that. But also taking along some sort of spiritual master, So taking along, some writing from St. Ignatius, or from Thomas Merton, or from Rumi, the Sufi mystic. So kind of all these people, and it's him reflecting on what does it mean to be a pilgrim, and how does hiking, how does being out in the outdoors, what does place have to say to us about who we are with God. It was an important book for me as I was finally discerning the Jesuits, and thinking I think I went on a lot of walks, and so that book was a companion during those months. Ian?
I'll answer, I guess, Father Doug, I'll take inspiration from you to answer. One of the books I read recently that really moved me, it was Schindler's List, originally titled Schindler's Ark, but and I think what moved me, if you're unfamiliar with it, it was turned into a movie by Steven Spielberg, and it's about a businessman, an industrialist, a German industrialist or Austrian, and actually a member of the Nazi Party, an official member of the Nazi Party, but used his industry and his business to save over 1,000 Jewish people from going to death camps. And I think what moved me most in reading these stories is how God can use even the things that we consider vices, that somehow, if we give those to God, and if we're working to do good in the world, God can even use those aspects of our personality and maybe our experience in order to do His work. Because Oskar Schindler was very much he was kind of a hedonist, but it was in sort of wining and dining officials and people with power that he was able to gain enough influence to save people, to bring people into his industry, which was really kind of a facade. They weren't really producing anything, at least that's what was purported in the book. And but it was using these things that these are vices, but God and God's goodness even used these aspects of his personality in order to save over 1,000 people who probably would have perished in camps, death camps otherwise. So there's various times in that book where I was moved to tears just with the boldness. Talk about the boldness with which this person went about really trying to save these people. And it was and even his wife, I remember reading, says he wasn't an extraordinary person after the war. But there was this extraordinary moment in which he really stepped forward and again saved so many people and who knows how many individuals, are alive today, right? The family members, the descendants of these people that he helped save. And so, just a really beautiful story for me about boldness and really God using all of our being, right, to do His work. That was an inspiration for me.
Great. Mm-hmm. Well, now you have 3 book recommendations that you can go check out when you have some time. Father Doug, thank you for being with us, making time in your schedule to be with us, and for giving your perspective, kind of a global perspective, which we don't get a chance to have on our show.
It was wonderful.
As much. Thank you.
Yeah, I could have listened to a couple more hours for sure. Yeah, so this was very exciting for me.
So thanks.
Thanks for inviting me here, and thanks for taking me with you to the prison.
Of course.
In a few minutes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And thank you for being with us yet again, and we will see you next week.
God bless.